Story 1: The Puppy That Never Existed. There's a kind of fear that never leaves you. It doesn't matter how many years pass or how far away you move, it clings to your bones. A whispering ghost reminding you of how close you came to the edge. I was only 6 years old when it happened. But even now, decades later, I can still hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, feel the chill of the autumn wind on my face, and see the shadows stretching long and dark across the street. My neighborhood back then was the kind of place that felt invincible to the dangers of the outside world. Everyone knew each other. Doors were left unlocked, and kids roamed freely from one house to the next. It was a community where you trusted your neighbors, and your neighbors trusted you. But trust can be a dangerous thing, especially when it blinds you to the truth that danger doesn't always come from far away. Sometimes, it's waiting for you right around the corner. This story is about one of those dangers, a moment that changed me and my entire community forever. It's a story I haven't told in detail until now, but I think it's time. Before we begin, let me ask you, have you ever felt the sudden, gut-wrenching realization that something isn't right? That someone or something is watching you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your stories. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Tells. Now, let's go back to that fateful day. It was a crisp October afternoon, and the smell of burning leaves hung in the air. Lisa and I were best friends, inseparable since the day we'd met. At 6 years old, we thought we knew everything about the world. We played hopscotch in front of her apartment building, made up silly songs, and swapped secrets we thought were too important to share with anyone else. That afternoon, Lisa's mom called down from their second-floor window. "Girls, I need you to run to the store for me. I'm out of cigarettes." "Okay, Mom," Lisa yelled back, her excitement palpable. It wasn't just an errand, it was an adventure. Her mom handed us a crumpled $5 bill and a note. "Go straight there and back. Don't talk to anyone except Mr. or Mrs. Anthony. You hear me?" "Yes, ma'am," we chorused. We skipped down the sidewalk, our feet crunching through fallen leaves. The corner store was only half a mile away, and it was the same route we'd walked dozens of times before. Back then, it didn't seem like a big deal. Parents trusted their kids to be independent, and kids, in turn, trusted that the world was as safe as it seemed. But safety is an illusion, isn't it? The store was small and cozy, run by the kind elderly couple everyone in the neighborhood called Mr. and Mrs. Anthony. We handed over the money and the note, and Mrs. Anthony chuckled, saying, "Tell your mom she's going to owe me a coffee for all these favors." We giggled, feeling like grown-ups as we picked out 2 lollipops with the leftover change. Cherry for me, grape for Lisa. With the cigarettes and candy in hand, we headed back toward Lisa's apartment, still laughing about which boy at school was the smelliest. It wasn't until we were halfway home that we noticed the car. It was a dark sedan, old but well-maintained. At first, it was just another car on the street. But as we walked, we realized it wasn't passing us. Instead, it crept along the curb at a snail's pace, the engine rumbling low like a predator waiting to pounce. "Why's that car going so slow?" Lisa whispered, her voice tight. "I don't know," I replied, my stomach twisting into knots. The car pulled up beside us, and the passenger window rolled down with a mechanical whine. Inside were 2 men, both in their late 20s or early 30s. The man in the passenger seat leaned out, his greasy hair peeking out from under a baseball cap. His smile was wide but didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Hey, girls," he said, his voice smooth but sickly sweet. "What are you doing out here all alone?" Lisa grabbed my hand. "Come on," she murmured, tugging me forward. But the man wasn't done. "Wait. Have you seen a little puppy around here? He's lost. Poor thing loves little girls like you. Can you help us find him?" The words hit me like ice water. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But my feet felt glued to the ground. Lisa yanked my arm, snapping me out of my daze. "Let's go," she hissed. We picked up our pace, our shoes scuffing against the pavement. But the car kept following, inching closer. "Come on, girls. It'll only take a second," the man pressed, his tone shifting from friendly to impatient. By now, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Lisa squeezed my hand so tightly it hurt. We didn't look back, didn't answer, just kept walking as fast as we could without breaking into a run. And then, the car stopped. I heard the creak of a door opening and the crunch of heavy boots on leaves. "Hey," the man shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. I turned my head just in time to see him lunging toward me, his hand clamped around my wrist like a steel trap. And I screamed, a raw, terrified sound that echoed down the empty street. Lisa didn't hesitate. She bolted, her own scream cutting through the air as she sprinted toward her apartment building. "Dad! Help!" she yelled at the top of her lungs. The man's grip on my wrist tightened, his nails digging into my skin. I struggled, kicking and twisting. But he was too strong. That's when I saw him, Uncle Dennis, charging out of the garage like an avenging angel, a baseball bat clenched tightly in his hands. His face was a mask of rage. "Let her go," he roared, his voice booming with authority. The man froze for a split second, then shoved me away and scrambled back into the car. The engine roared to life, and the sedan sped off, tires squealing. Uncle Dennis dropped the bat and scooped me up into his arms. I clung to him, sobbing uncontrollably. "You're safe now," he murmured, though his voice trembled with the weight of what had just happened. That day changed everything. The neighborhood went from being a carefree haven to a place filled with caution and vigilance. Parents no longer sent their kids to the store alone. Playtime was always supervised, and no one trusted strangers anymore. As for me, the scars weren't just physical. Even now, decades later, I can't stand the sound of a car slowing down beside me. The memory of that man's hand on my wrist is something I'll never shake. Sometimes, late at night, I think about what might have happened if Uncle Dennis hadn't been there. It's a question I'll never have an answer to. But one thing is certain, that moment shaped the rest of my life. Let this story serve as a reminder to stay vigilant, no matter how safe your surroundings might seem. And please, share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Story 2, The College Stalker. When I stepped onto my college campus for the first time, I felt a surge of hope. College was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to reinvent myself, make lifelong friends, and work toward the future I dreamed of. I was nervous, sure, but excited. The world felt full of possibilities. What I didn't know was that this small, seemingly unremarkable college would become the stage for one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Have you ever met someone who gave you an inexplicable sense of unease? Someone who seemed harmless at first but whose presence slowly wrapped around you like a vice, squeezing until you couldn't breathe? That's exactly what happened to me. And his name was Jeremy. Before we dive into this story, I want to ask you, how do you handle that gut feeling when something feels off? Do you ignore it? Or do you listen? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Tells for more stories that remind you why you should trust your instincts. I was a music performance major at a small performing arts college on Long Island. The school wasn't glamorous, it had a reputation for being easy to get into and even easier to pass. Still, I was determined to make the most of it. The first few weeks were uneventful. I kept my head down, focused on my classes, and avoided the chaotic energy of campus life. I wasn't interested in parties or cliques. I just wanted to study and maybe make a friend or two. Then, I met Jeremy. It happened in the cafeteria. I was standing in line, staring at the menu, when I felt someone step a little too close. "Hey," a voice said. I turned to see a lanky guy with messy hair and an awkward smile. He looked harmless enough, but something about the way he stared made me uneasy. "I'm Jeremy," he said, holding out his hand. I hesitated but shook it. "I'm Emily." He launched into a stream of questions. What was I majoring in? Where was I from? What did I think of the school so far? He seemed overly eager, his tone too familiar for someone I'd just met. When my food was ready, I grabbed it and quickly excused myself. "Nice to meet you," I said, walking away as fast as I could without running. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. Jeremy started showing up everywhere. At first, I chalked it up to coincidence. It was a small campus, after all. But then the coincidences became too frequent to ignore. He'd sit near me in the cafeteria, always trying to strike up a conversation. He'd wave at me from across the quad, even if I pretended not to see him. One time, I walked into the library and found him already there, sitting in a spot that gave him a clear view of the entrance. He smiled when he saw me, but I felt no warmth in it, only a strange, predatory satisfaction. The turning point came one afternoon when I was walking back to my dorm. I heard footsteps behind me and glanced over my shoulder. Jeremy was there, a few paces behind, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. "Hey, Emily," he called, quickening his pace to catch up. I froze, forcing a polite smile as he came to stand beside me. "What are you up to?" he asked, his tone casual. "Just heading back to my room," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "I could walk you," he offered. "No thanks. I'm fine." His smile faltered, and something dark flickered in his eyes. "Why are you always brushing me off?" The question caught me off guard, and my heart began to race. "I'm not," I lied. "I'm just busy." He stared at me for a long moment, then shrugged. "Okay. See you later." I didn't wait to see where he went. I hurried back to my dorm, locking the door behind me and leaning against it, trying to calm the shaking in my hands. Over the next few weeks, Jeremy's behavior escalated. He started texting me, even though I'd never given him my number. "Hey, Emily. Saw you in class today. You looked cute. Why didn't you say hi to me at lunch? I thought we were friends. Why are you ignoring me?" I blocked his number, but that didn't stop him. He began showing up outside my dorm at odd hours. One night, I came back from a late rehearsal to find him standing near the entrance, his face partially hidden by the shadows. "Hey, Emily," he called as I approached. I pretended not to hear him, fumbling with my keys as I rushed inside. The next night, I was jolted awake by a knock on my window. My dorm was on the ground floor, and my blinds were drawn, but I could see the outline of someone standing just outside. "Emily," Jeremy's voice called. "I know you're in there. Let me in." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped, and I heard his footsteps retreating. I thought the worst was over, but I was wrong. A few nights later, I was in my room studying when I heard a loud pounding on the window. This time, Jeremy wasn't trying to be subtle. "Emily," he shouted, his voice raw and angry. "Open the door right now." I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed campus security. "There's someone trying to break into my room," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "Stay inside," the officer said. "We're on our way." Jeremy's pounding grew more violent, and I thought the glass might shatter. "You're going to regret this," he screamed. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for help to arrive. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens, and Jeremy's voice stopped. Through the crack in the blinds, I watched as 2 campus police officers grabbed him and hauled him away. He was kicking and screaming, his voice echoing down the empty street. The next morning, I received an email from the school. Jeremy had been expelled. I should have felt relieved, but the fear didn't go away. Every time I walked across campus, I felt like someone was watching me. Every knock on the door made my stomach lurch. I started carrying pepper spray in my bag and sleeping with a chair wedged under the doorknob. Even now, years later, I can't shake the paranoia. I double-check my locks every night, avoid ground-floor apartments, and keep my blinds tightly closed. Jeremy is gone, but the fear he planted in me remains. If there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's to trust your instincts. If someone makes you uncomfortable, listen to that feeling. It might just save your life. Story 3: The Candy Store Robbery. When my family immigrated to the United States in the late 1960s, we were chasing the classic American dream. We left behind the struggles of our homeland, seeking a better life in the bustling city streets of New York. The path wasn't easy. We faced poverty, prejudice, and countless challenges. But we persevered. Eventually, things began to improve. We opened a small candy store in the Bronx, a family-run business that became a beacon of hope. But sometimes, even the brightest lights cast the darkest shadows. This is the story of the day I almost lost my life in that store, and how a single moment of terror left a scar that reminds me every day of how fragile life truly is. Before we dive in, let me ask you, have you ever been in a situation where your life was at stake? A moment where time seemed to slow down, and survival wasn't guaranteed? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you overcame it. It was a warm afternoon in the summer of 1980, and I was working my usual shift at our family's candy store. The air inside was sweet with the scent of chocolate and licorice, a welcome escape from the grime and chaos of the Bronx streets. The store wasn't much, just a narrow space with shelves packed with brightly colored candy jars and a glass counter displaying rows of gumdrops, caramel chews, and chocolate bars. A small cash register sat on the counter. A modest collection of bills and coins inside. That day was slow. A few customers had come and gone, a mother buying lollipops for her kids. A teenager grabbing a soda. By mid-afternoon, the store was empty. And I sat behind the counter reading the newspaper, waiting for the next customer to walk in. The bell above the door jingled, pulling me from my thoughts. I looked up, expecting another friendly face. Instead, I froze. A man stepped inside, dressed in all black. He wore a beanie pulled low over his forehead, sunglasses that hid his eyes, and a mask covering the lower half of his face. My heart sank. He wasn't here for candy. "Open the register," he barked, pulling out a gun and pointing it directly at me. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, panic clouding my thoughts. I raised my hands instinctively, my voice trembling as I stammered. Okay. Just don't hurt me." The man's grip on the gun tightened. "Hurry up," he shouted, his voice laced with impatience. I reached for the register, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the keys. My fingers fumbled, slipping off the buttons as I struggled to focus. The register wouldn't open, and my fear only made it worse. I'm trying," I stuttered, my chest heaving with every shaky breath. "Don't play games with me," he roared, slamming his free hand on the counter. "Do you want to die?" I don't know what came over me in that moment. Maybe it was the sheer terror. Or maybe it was the anger bubbling beneath my fear. How dare this man come into our store, our little slice of the American dream, and threaten my life? "I'm not playing games," I shouted back, tears streaming down my face. The man's face twisted with rage, and he lifted the gun higher, aiming it directly at my head. "Open the damn drawer, or I'll blow your head off," he screamed, his voice echoing through the empty store. My fingers finally found the right keys, and the register popped open with a mechanical ding. Relief flooded through me. But it was short-lived. The man reached across the counter, grabbing handfuls of cash and shoving it into a bag. But as he did, something seemed to snap inside him. "You took too long," he said, his voice low and dangerous. I barely had time to process his words before he pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, a sharp crack that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. I felt a searing pain in my cheek and stumbled backward, clutching my face. For a moment, I thought I was dead. The world seemed to blur around me, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. The man didn't wait to see if I was alive. He grabbed the rest of the cash and bolted out the door, the bell jingling mockingly in his wake. I collapsed to the floor, my hands slick with blood as I pressed them against the wound. The pain was excruciating, but I was alive. The bullet had grazed my cheek, missing my skull by mere inches. Within minutes, neighbors rushed into the store, drawn by the sound of the gunshot. Someone called the police and an ambulance, and I was whisked away to the hospital. The bullet wound wasn't deep, but the emotional scars ran far deeper. I spent the night in the hospital, replaying the event over and over in my mind. I couldn't shake the image of the gun, the sound of the shot, or the chilling realization of how close I'd come to death. The police questioned me, but I couldn't give them much. The man had been covered head to toe, and I hadn't seen his face. They assured me they'd do their best to find him, but deep down, I knew the chances were slim. The candy store reopened a few days later. But nothing felt the same. My family was supportive, insisting I take time to recover. But I couldn't bring myself to step behind the counter again. Eventually, life moved on. Our family's financial situation improved, and we moved to a safer neighborhood. But every time I looked in the mirror, the scar on my cheek stared back at me, a permanent reminder of that terrifying day. To this day, I still flinch at loud noises. I avoid small, enclosed spaces, and I can't help but glance over my shoulder whenever I'm in a store alone. But I've also learned something important: resilience isn't about never being afraid. It's about facing that fear and surviving anyway. Sometimes, the scars we carry are physical. Other times, they're invisible, etched into our minds and hearts. Either way, they tell a story of survival, of strength, and of the fragility of life. Have you ever experienced a moment that changed you forever? A brush with danger that left its mark, either physically or emotionally? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you found the strength to move forward. Story 4: The Cult Yard Sale. There's something magical about yard sales. It's not just about the bargains, it's the thrill of the hunt. The idea that you might stumble upon a hidden treasure in someone's cluttered front yard. An antique vase, a vintage record, or a dusty old book that holds more value than its worn cover suggests. Yard sales are a gamble, and I've always been drawn to that sense of adventure. But sometimes, the hunt can take you too far. Sometimes, the gamble isn't worth it. This story is about the day my love for yard sales led me to a place I wish I'd never found. It's about the strange people I encountered, the unease that settled in my gut, and the moment I realized I was in danger. Before I dive in, let me ask you, have you ever found yourself in a situation where everything seemed normal on the surface, but something deep down told you to run? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you trusted your instincts. It was a Saturday morning, the perfect day for yard sales. I hopped into my Jeep with a coffee in hand and a list of sales I'd marked from the newspaper and online posts. As I drove through town, stopping here and there to browse, I kept an eye out for any handwritten signs that might lead to unexpected treasures. Around mid-morning, I spotted a makeshift sign propped up against a large rock on the side of a rural road. It read "Yard Sale" in big, bold letters, with an arrow pointing down a narrow gravel driveway. The rock had something religious carved into it, God's Haven or something like that, but I didn't pay it much mind. Curiosity got the better of me. I turned down the driveway, the trees closing in overhead as the gravel crunched beneath my tires. After what felt like an eternity, the forest opened up to reveal a beautiful white house with a sprawling yard. Tables were set up across the lawn, covered with items ranging from old toys to kitchenware to folded clothes. It should have been the perfect find. But something felt off. There were about 30 people milling around the yard. But they weren't dressed like typical yard sale shoppers. Every single one of them wore a gray jumpsuit. It wasn't the kind of uniform you'd see at a factory or a mechanic's shop. These looked handmade, like they were meant to match. The people moved slowly, methodically, arranging items on tables or standing in small groups, speaking in low tones. As I stepped out of my car, several heads turned toward me at once. Their stares were unnerving, their expressions blank but not unkind. I tried to shake off the unease. Maybe this was a church group or some kind of community organization. I walked toward a table covered with books and knickknacks, scanning the items for anything interesting. "Good morning," a woman's voice said, startling me. I turned to see a woman standing behind a table with a money box. She was in her late 40s, with sharp eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. "Let me know if you need help finding anything," she said, her tone overly cheerful. "Thanks. Just browsing," I said, pretending to be more relaxed than I felt. As I moved between the tables, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced up, someone in a gray jumpsuit was looking at me. Their gazes weren't hostile, but they lingered too long, as if they were sizing me up. Behind the house, I noticed several small buildings, tiny cabins or sheds, and people were moving in and out of them. There was a strange rhythm to their movements, almost like a choreographed dance. "Would you like to come inside?" the woman at the money box asked, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Excuse me?" I said, taken aback. "Inside the house," she said, her smile unwavering. "We have more items in there. You might find something special." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I glanced toward the house, its pristine white walls gleaming in the sunlight. For the first time, I noticed how quiet it was. No music, no children laughing, just the low hum of conversations and the occasional clink of metal as someone rearranged items on a table. "I think I'm good out here," I said, taking a step back. The woman's smile faltered. She nodded, but her eyes flicked toward 3 men nearby. They stopped what they were doing and began walking toward me. My heart pounded as the men closed in, their movements deliberate but not rushed. I was about to bolt when an older man appeared at my side. "Sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice low but firm. "We really have to get going." The woman's eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't argue. The men hesitated, their expressions unreadable. The older man gently took my arm and guided me back toward my jeep. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his tone urgent. As we reached my car, I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling. The man stood by my door, his eyes scanning the yard as if expecting someone to stop us. "Just take it easy," he said, his voice calm but insistent. "Get in your car and leave. Don't look back." I slid into the driver's seat, my heart racing. As I started the engine, I glanced back toward the yard. Everyone had stopped what they were doing. They stood perfectly still, their faces turned toward me, watching in eerie silence. I backed out of the driveway as quickly as I could without losing control. The trees seemed to close in around me as I sped down the gravel road, the sense of relief growing with every passing second. When I reached the main road, I pulled over to catch my breath. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I looked in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road was empty. I don't know what that place was, whether it was a cult, a commune, or something even darker. But I know one thing for sure: if that older man hadn't stepped in, I might not have made it out. I've driven through that area a few times since then, hoping to find the driveway again. But it's as if the place vanished. The rock with the religious inscription, the winding gravel path, the white house, it's all gone. Part of me wonders if I imagined the whole thing. But the memory of those gray jumpsuits and those blank, unblinking stares is too vivid to dismiss. Sometimes, late at night, I think about what might have happened if I'd gone inside the house. Would I have disappeared without a trace? Would anyone have known where to look for me? This experience taught me a valuable lesson: trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Have you ever stumbled into a situation that felt wrong? Like a nightmare you couldn't wake up from? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you found your way out. Story 5: The Tree People. The woods have a way of amplifying everything, every crackling twig, every whisper of the wind, every flicker of shadow just beyond the campfire's glow. Out there, away from the hum of cities and the safety of crowds, you realize how small and vulnerable you really are. That's what we wanted. Or so we thought. A weekend of camping in a remote stretch of Alberta's wilderness, a chance to disconnect, to laugh, to share stories under the stars. But the forest had other plans. Looking back, it's hard to believe how close we came to losing everything. What started as a fun weekend turned into a nightmare none of us could have imagined. Before we dive in, let me ask you, have you ever been in a situation where the very air around you felt wrong? Where the silence wasn't peaceful but menacing? Let me know in the comments below. I want to hear your stories. We were 6 in total: me, my girlfriend Ashley, and 4 of our closest friends: Eric, Jake, Mike, and Jamie. Eric and I were the outdoorsy ones, always dragging our more city-inclined friends into the woods. This time, we'd chosen a spot deep in the forests of northern Alberta, far from any trails or campgrounds. The clearing we found was perfect. It was surrounded by towering pines, with just enough open space to pitch our tents and build a fire. The only sound was the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. By the time we arrived and set up camp, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the forest in hues of orange and red. We laughed, cooked over the fire, and swapped stories as the stars blinked into view. But even then, there was something off. Ashley was the first to notice. "Did you hear that?" she asked, glancing toward the tree line. "Hear what?" I replied, leaning closer to the fire. "Something in the woods." It sounded like voices. We all fell silent, straining to listen. But there was nothing, just the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind. "It's probably just the wind," Eric said, shrugging it off. But Ashley didn't look convinced. Later that night, I realized I'd left my favorite hat in the car. It was a stupid thing to be superstitious about, but that hat had been with me on every camping trip. Eric offered to come with me, and we set off through the woods with flashlights in hand. The car wasn't far, maybe a quarter mile, but the path was dark and uneven. The beams of our flashlights barely pierced the thick undergrowth, and the silence felt heavier the further we went. Halfway there, we heard it, a faint rustling sound, like someone, or something, moving through the trees. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Eric nodded, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol he always carried on these trips. "Yeah. Stay close." We stopped, listening. The sound came again. This time from the opposite direction, a low murmur, like voices just out of reach. My heart began to race. "Do you think someone's out here?" Eric didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for us to keep moving. When we reached the car, we backed up against it, scanning the tree line with our flashlights. The murmurs had stopped, but the sense of being watched hadn't. "We're not alone out here," Eric muttered. We returned to camp, trying to shake off the unease. "Did you see anything?" Ashley asked as we sat back down by the fire. No, I said, forcing a smile. It's fine. Probably just animals. But as the night went on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind felt like a threat. Then, around midnight, we saw them. Dark figures emerged from the forest. Their movements slow and deliberate. They were dressed in heavy camouflage, blending almost perfectly with the trees. At first, we thought they were hunters. But something about them was wrong. They didn't carry rifles. They didn't call out to us. They just stood there, watching. Who are they? Jamie whispered, her voice trembling. Stay calm, Eric said, his voice steady but tense. He stood, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Don't make any sudden moves. Eric took a step forward, raising his voice. Can we help you? The figures didn't respond. Instead, they took a step closer, the firelight glinting off something metallic on their bodies. That's when we heard it, a gunshot. Sharp and deafening. A bullet hit the ground a few feet from where Eric stood, sending up a spray of dirt and debris. Sniper! Eric shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me back toward the tents. Panic erupted. We scrambled to gather what we could, shoving supplies into backpacks while keeping an eye on the advancing figures. Another shot rang out, shattering the taillight of Eric's truck. They're telling us to leave, Eric said, his voice tight with anger. We abandoned the tents, the sleeping bags, everything we couldn't carry, piling into the truck. We sped away, the headlights cutting through the darkness. As we drove down the dirt road, I looked back. The figures were still there, standing silently in the clearing, their faces obscured by the shadows. We didn't stop driving until we reached the highway. Even then, none of us spoke for a long time, the weight of what had happened settling over us like a heavy fog. When we finally did talk, the questions came in a rush. Who were those people? What did they want? Why were they armed? We reported the incident to the local authorities, but nothing came of it. The area was remote, they said. Probably just hunters or a survivalist group. But we knew better. Those people weren't hunters. They weren't hikers. They were something else entirely. And they didn't want us there. To this day, I don't know who, or what, we encountered in those woods. But one thing is certain, they were organized, armed, and territorial. Were they part of some cult? A militia? Or something even darker? I don't know. And I don't want to find out. Have you ever encountered something in the wilderness that defied explanation? A moment that made you question your safety and your sanity? Share your story in the comments below. Story 6, The Persistent Neighbor. When I moved into my cozy little house in a quiet rural neighborhood, I thought I'd found the perfect retreat. It was a modest place, but just what I needed, an escape from the noise of the city and a space where I could focus on finishing my PhD. My dad, who came to help me settle in, even assured me that the neighborhood was perfect. The guy next door, he said, is the nicest guy you'll ever meet. For the first few days, it seemed like he was right. My neighbor was eager to help, friendly to a fault. He'd wave every time I stepped outside and even offered to share his tools if I ever needed them. I thought I'd lucked out. But looking back, I wish I'd paid closer attention to the warning signs, the ones that started small but quickly spiraled out of control. This is the story of how I became trapped in a living nightmare. Haunted by a man who wouldn't take no for an answer. Have you ever had a neighbor who gave you chills? Someone who seemed nice at first but slowly revealed their true colors? Share your story in the comments below. I want to hear how you handled it. It all started the day I moved in. My neighbor, whom I'll call Tom, came over to introduce himself. He was in his 40s. With a broad smile and an enthusiastic handshake. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said. "If you ever need anything, just holler. Here. Let's exchange numbers. So you can text me if you need help." I didn't think twice about it. Exchanging numbers seemed like the polite thing to do. What could possibly go wrong? For the first few days, he was just a friendly presence, a quick wave from his yard or a cheerful "good morning" as I left for class. But then the text started. "Good morning, sweetie. Hope you're settling in. Hey. I saw your light was on late last night. Are you okay? I left you a little gift on your porch, just a welcome to the neighborhood. When I got home that day, I found a small hand-painted dish for my cat sitting on the porch. It seemed like a kind gesture. But something about it felt off. Why was he paying so much attention to me?" The texts kept coming. They weren't overtly inappropriate. But they were unsettling in their frequency and tone. "You looked really pretty today. Just thought you should know. Are you seeing anyone? You seem too nice to be alone. I can keep an eye on your house for you when you're out. You know. Make sure you're safe." I tried to set boundaries. Politely but firmly telling him I wasn't interested in anything beyond a neighborly relationship. He brushed it off, insisting he just wanted to be a good friend. But his actions told a different story. One morning, I found a dead squirrel on my driveway, placed carefully near the driver's side door of my car. Its tiny body was crushed, its fur matted with blood. My stomach churned as I stared at it, bile rising in my throat. Later that day, I got a text from Tom. "I saw someone put a dead squirrel near your car. Don't worry, I moved it for you." The implication was clear. He wanted me to know he'd been there, watching. Things got worse from there. One afternoon, I noticed an unspent shotgun shell sitting on the bricks of his front yard. When I asked him about it, trying to sound casual, he gave me a chilling smile. "It's just a warning," he said. "For anyone who gets too close to my property." A few days later, he left a hand-carved wooden sign propped up against my fence. It read, "Here lies the last SOB who played games with me." I called the police after that. But they said there wasn't much they could do. "He hasn't directly threatened you," they told me. It's creepy. But it's not a crime. So I started locking every window and door in my house. Even during the day. I installed security cameras, lining the perimeter of my property with their unblinking eyes. The breaking point came on New Year's Eve. I was asleep when I woke to the sound of screaming outside my window. "Happy, expletive, New Year!" Tom bellowed, his voice raw and slurred. "You think you're too good for me? Huh? You'll see." I turned on the security cameras and saw him leaning out of his window, yelling obscenities at my house. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "I'll blow this whole, expletive, house up." I called the police, my hands shaking as I described what was happening. When they arrived, they told me there was nothing they could do. "He didn't say your name," one officer explained. "And technically, he's on his own property." I felt helpless. A week later, I heard hammering at 1 a.m. I peeked outside to see Tom dismantling his privacy fence. By morning, the 6-foot barrier that separated our yards was gone, replaced with a pathetic 3-foot remnant. Now, nothing stood between me and him. Every day since, I've lived in constant fear. I can't step outside without feeling his eyes on me. I've stopped parking in my driveway, choosing instead to leave my car on the street. My boyfriend moved in to help, but even with him here, I feel vulnerable. Tom's harassment hasn't stopped. He shouts threats from his porch, leaves bizarre gifts on my property, and occasionally walks past my house, staring into my windows. We're saving up to move, but it's not happening fast enough. Until then, I'm stuck living next to a man who seems to take pleasure in tormenting me. Sometimes, I wonder what I did to deserve this. Why me? But deep down, I know it isn't about me, it's about him. People like Tom thrive on control and intimidation. They push boundaries, testing how far they can go before someone stops them. And in this case, the system has failed me. I've learned to trust my instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And if someone seems too good to be true, they probably are. If you've ever dealt with a situation like this, you're not alone. The exhaustion, the fear, the constant sense of unease, it's a heavy burden to bear. Have you ever had a neighbor or someone in your life who made you feel unsafe? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments below. I want to hear how you found strength in the face of fear. Story 7: The Abandoned Red Shack. The promise of untouched land holds a certain allure, doesn't it? Miles of wilderness, free from the grip of urban sprawl, where the air is clean and silence reigns. My family believed that too. When my uncle found a listing for an expansive, remote plot of land near Red Oak, Oklahoma, he couldn't resist checking it out. It was supposed to be a simple day trip, a chance to explore, breathe the fresh forest air, and maybe dream about the possibilities of owning a piece of the untamed wild. But what we found there, the shack, the oppressive woods, the sinister warning left on the road, made us question if some places are better left undiscovered. Before we get into it, let me ask you, have you ever been somewhere that felt wrong? A place that made your skin crawl even though there was no obvious reason? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you dealt with the unease. The drive to the property was long and monotonous, with miles of narrow roads cutting through thick woods. At first, we were in high spirits. My dad hummed along to the radio. My mom read a magazine, and my uncle rattled on about the potential of the land. But as the trees grew denser and the road narrower, the atmosphere in the car shifted. The sunlight barely filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward us. Getting a little creepy. Huh, my dad joked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. I nodded, trying to ignore the growing unease in my chest. When we finally arrived, my excitement faded. The land was a disappointment, overgrown and desolate, with no clear landmarks or features. Just endless trees and tangled undergrowth. "This is underwhelming," my mom muttered, folding her arms. "It's got potential," my uncle said, ever the optimist. "Let's take a look around." We parked the car on the side of the dirt road and began our hike. The woods were eerily silent. The only sounds the crunch of our boots on dead leaves and the occasional rustle of branches. After about an hour, we stumbled upon a clearing. At its center stood a small red shack, weathered and crooked, The peeling paint and warped boards gave it a sinister air. As if it were holding secrets no one was meant to uncover. "Is this on the listing?" my dad asked, frowning. "No mention of it," my uncle replied, stepping closer. The shack didn't look like it belonged. It was too intact. Too deliberately placed. My mom shifted uneasily, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "I don't like this," she said. "Let's just go." But curiosity got the better of us. My uncle pushed the door open, and a wave of foul air hit us, making us gag. Inside, the shack was dark and cramped, with the sunlight barely penetrating through the cracks in the walls. Rotting cans of food littered the floor, their contents oozing out and attracting flies. A filthy blanket lay in the corner, stained with something dark and unidentifiable. "Someone's been living here," my dad said, his voice low. "Recently," my uncle added, pointing to a half-eaten piece of bread on a makeshift table. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and an oppressive silence hung over the place. It felt as though the walls themselves were watching us. "We shouldn't be here," my mom said, backing away. We left the shack quickly, our unease growing with every step. But as we tried to retrace our path back to the car, something strange happened. The woods seemed to change around us. "I swear we came this way," my dad said, stopping to look around. "No, it was that tree," my uncle argued, pointing in a different direction. The deeper we walked, the more disoriented we became. Every tree looked the same. Every path led nowhere. My mom was visibly shaking, her head darting from side to side. "Stop," she whispered. "Just stop for a second. Do you hear that?" We fell silent, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, the sound of branches snapping. "Someone's out there," I whispered, my heart pounding. "Let's move," my dad said, his voice tight. Now, after what felt like hours, we finally stumbled back onto the road. Relief washed over us, but it was short-lived. As we made our way toward the car, a horrific sight stopped us in our tracks. In the middle of the road lay the charred remains of an animal carcass. Smoke still curled from its blackened body, filling the air with the stench of burnt flesh. "Oh my God," my mom gasped, covering her mouth. My dad stepped forward cautiously, his face pale. "This wasn't here before," he said. "Someone put this here. For us." We stood frozen, the crackling of the burning carcass the only sound. My mom clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "Right now." We ran to the car, our footsteps echoing in the stillness. When we reached it, my stomach dropped. Deep scratches ran along the hood and doors, as if someone, or something, had raked claws across the metal. My dad didn't waste a second. He started the car, and we sped away, gravel flying behind us. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, back on paved roads. The tension in the car was palpable, none of us daring to speak. My uncle decided not to buy the land, no surprise there. But even years later, that day lingers in the back of my mind. The shack, the burning carcass, the scratches on the car, it all felt like a warning. Recently, I stumbled across a documentary about a family that disappeared near Red Oak. They had been looking at land for sale in the same area. The details were chillingly familiar, rumors of cult activity, Strange symbols carved into trees. And animal sacrifices found in the woods. It made me wonder, did we narrowly escape something far worse that day? Was the shack a hideout for something sinister? Were the scratches and the burning carcass meant to send a message? I don't have the answers. But I know one thing, I'll never set foot in those woods again. If you've ever been somewhere that felt wrong, you know the kind of fear I'm talking about. The kind that crawls under your skin and stays there long after you've left. Have you ever experienced something similar? A place or a moment that made you feel like you weren't supposed to be there? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you escaped. Story 8: The White Car Stalker. It's strange how an ordinary sight can become the harbinger of your worst nightmare. At first glance, there was nothing sinister about the white car parked at the end of our driveway. Its engine idled softly, headlights dim, as if waiting for something, or someone. From my bedroom window, I watched it for what felt like an eternity. Unease creeping up my spine. The driver didn't get out. Didn't honk. Didn't move. I convinced myself they were just lost or taking a break. But deep down, I felt it. Something was wrong. That was the moment my life changed. For the next 3 years, that white car, and the man who drove it, would haunt my every step. Before we dive into this story, let me ask you, have you ever felt like someone was watching you? A stranger whose presence felt too intentional to be coincidence? Share your experiences in the comments below. I want to know how you handled it. The first encounter with the white car was just the beginning. A week later, I saw it again, parked farther down the road as I walked to the mailbox. This time, the windows were rolled up, and the driver was obscured by the afternoon glare. My gut told me to hurry back inside. So I did. I told my parents about it, but they brushed it off. It's probably just a neighbor, my dad said. Maybe someone new in the area. I wanted to believe him, but something about the car gnawed at me. Soon, the sightings became more frequent. The car would appear at odd times, early mornings when I left for school, late at night when I was sitting on the porch, even parked outside the grocery store when I went with friends. It wasn't just the car. Cigarette butts began showing up around our yard. We didn't smoke, and we didn't have neighbors close enough for it to be accidental. The butts seemed strategically placed, under my bedroom window, near the side door, even on the porch steps. Every time I saw one, I felt like I was being claimed. A month after the first sighting, the stalker's behavior took a darker turn. One morning, I stepped outside to find a dead bird on our porch. Its wings were splayed open unnaturally, and its eyes were wide, lifeless. My stomach churned as I stared at the grotesque display. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, maybe a cat had left it there. But when another appeared the following week, I knew it wasn't random. The dead animals kept coming. Birds, rabbits, even a squirrel, all arranged as if to send a message. The final straw came late one night. Jason, my boyfriend, had just dropped me off after a date. As I walked toward the house, I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke. It was faint but unmistakable. I froze, scanning the dark yard. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't see anyone, but I knew he was there. The most terrifying moment of the ordeal happened about a year in. Jason and I had gone out to see a late-night movie. It was one of the rare times I felt normal. Like the shadow of the white car wasn't looming over me. But as we walked back to his truck, the feeling returned. parked directly across from us. Under a flickering streetlight was the white car. Jason noticed it first. "That the one you've been talking about?" he asked, his tone serious. I nodded, my breath catching in my throat. The headlights snapped on, illuminating us in the otherwise empty lot. Slowly, the car rolled forward, stopping a few feet from Jason's truck. "Stay here," Jason said, stepping in front of me protectively. The driver got out, his movements deliberate and calm. He was tall and wiry, dressed in dark clothes. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his expression was devoid of any emotion, except for a faint, unsettling smile. Jason grabbed the baseball bat he kept in the back of his truck. "You've got 5 seconds to get out of here," he said, his voice low and firm. The man didn't say a word. He tilted his head slightly, like he was studying us, before turning and walking back to his car. The car's tires squealed as he sped off, leaving us shaken but unharmed. After the driveway encounter, the stalker's presence became more erratic but no less terrifying. Some nights, I'd wake to the faint smell of cigarette smoke wafting through my open window. Other times, I'd hear faint footsteps outside, only to find no one there when I looked. The cigarette butts began reappearing, now with fresh ashes, as if he'd been smoking right outside. I started sleeping with my window locked and a knife under my pillow. Jason insisted on staying over more often, but even his presence couldn't erase the sense of dread that filled the house. The final confrontation happened late one winter night. Jason and I were sitting in his truck in my driveway, waiting for my parents to return from a late dinner. It was dark, the air thick with an uneasy silence. Then, the white car appeared. It emerged from the shadows, headlights cutting through the darkness, and parked at the end of the driveway. "He's here," I whispered, my voice trembling. Jason didn't hesitate. He grabbed his bat and stepped out of the truck, positioning himself between me and the approaching car. The man stepped out again, his movements slow and deliberate. This time, he didn't smile. He just stood there, staring at me through the windshield. Jason yelled, threatening to call the police. But the man didn't flinch. He simply turned, got back in his car, and drove away. That was the last time I saw him. After that night, the sightings stopped. The cigarette butts, the dead animals, the unsettling sense of being watched, it all vanished. At first, I felt relief. But as the weeks turned into months, the relief gave way to unease. Why had he stopped? Did he get arrested? Did he move on to someone else? Or was he just waiting for the right time to return? Even now, years later, I still catch myself looking over my shoulder. I moved to a different state, far from where it all began. But the fear lingers. Living through something like this changes you. You become hyper-aware of your surroundings, constantly scanning for threats. You start to question every stranger's intentions, every sound in the night. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you? Like you were living in a thriller you couldn't escape? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how you found the strength to keep going. Story 9, The Fake Park Ranger. The forest was my sanctuary. I grew up in a quiet Appalachian town, where the woods were vast and mysterious, filled with trails that seemed to stretch forever. At 13, I thought I knew every rock, tree, and hidden path. My black Labrador, Felicia, was my constant companion, bounding ahead as we explored the wilderness together. But even in a place that feels like home, there can be shadows. It started as a peaceful autumn day. I'd packed a bag with snacks and a book, planning to spend the afternoon at my favorite ridge overlooking the valley. But what began as a typical hike turned into something that still haunts me, a chilling reminder that sometimes the biggest threats come not from the wilderness but from the people who wander into it. Have you ever trusted a place so deeply, only to have it betray you? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories of when your instincts kept you safe. The trail to the ridge was familiar, a path I could navigate with my eyes closed. The crisp autumn air carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Felicia darted ahead, her tail wagging as she sniffed and explored. When we reached the ridge, I settled on my favorite rock, a smooth boulder with a panoramic view of the valley below. The world felt endless from up there, a patchwork of orange and gold leaves stretching to the horizon. I pulled out my book, letting the stillness wrap around me. Felicia, usually content to lay beside me, started acting strange. She stood up, her ears twitching, a low growl rumbling in her throat. I followed her gaze and spotted movement in the dense brush below. Probably a deer, I muttered. But the unease crept in as I watched the figure emerge. It was a man, wearing hiking clothes and carrying nothing but a bottle of water. He looked like he was in his mid-20s, average height, with a wiry build. His expression was pleasant, too pleasant, as he climbed toward me. "Hey there," he called out, his voice calm and friendly. Felicia growled louder, planting herself between us. "Whoa. Easy," he said, stopping a few feet away. "I didn't mean to scare you." "Who are you?" I asked, my voice steady despite the growing knot in my stomach. "I'm one of the park rangers," he said, flashing a quick smile. "Just checking the area." My chest tightened. We only had one park ranger in the area, and I knew him well. This man wasn't him. "I didn't know there were any rangers out here today," I said carefully, gripping Felicia's leash. "Yeah. We're doing some extra patrols," he replied, his eyes scanning the ridge. "You out here by yourself?" The question sent a jolt of fear through me. I forced a smile and said, "No, my dad's up here somewhere, checking trail cameras." The man's smile faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "Trail cameras? Huh? Yeah," I said, feigning confidence. "They're everywhere up here. My dad likes to monitor the wildlife." His eyes lingered on me, calculating. Then he took a step closer, and Felicia barked sharply, her hackles raised. "You should keep her on a leash," he said, his tone shifting. "You wouldn't want her to get into trouble." "We're not in the park," I shot back. "She's fine." His smile returned, but it was cold this time. "You never know who might come through here." My instincts screamed at me to leave. "Well, I should head back," I said, slinging my backpack over my shoulder. "It's getting late." "Do your parents know you're up here?" he pressed, his tone overly casual. "Yeah," I lied. "They're expecting me home soon." He nodded but didn't move. Felicia growled again, and I tightened my grip on her leash. "Come on, girl," I said, turning away. As I walked down the trail, I glanced over my shoulder. The man was still standing there, watching me. Every step felt heavier as I put distance between us. Felicia growling softly the entire way. I resisted the urge to run, knowing that panic would only make things worse. When I got home, I debated telling my parents. They were always cautious about me hiking alone, and I didn't want to lose my freedom. But something about the encounter unsettled me too much to stay silent. After I recounted the story, my dad's expression darkened. "There's no new ranger in the area," he said. He called our actual park ranger, who confirmed that no one else was authorized to patrol. Worse, he mentioned that someone had been caught illegally camping near the ridge recently, a man matching my description. A few days later, my dad's friend retrieved the film from one of the trail cameras. As we flipped through the images, my stomach dropped. There I was, sitting on my favorite rock, Felicia lying beside me, and there, standing just beyond the tree line, was the man. The photo made my skin crawl. He had been watching me long before I noticed him. After that day, I stopped hiking alone. Felicia and I stuck to the trails near our house, always letting someone know where we were going. I never returned to that ridge. I often think about what could have happened if I hadn't mentioned the trail cameras or if Felicia hadn't been with me. Did the man have darker intentions? I'll never know. But I'm grateful for my dog's instincts and the deterrent of those cameras. That day taught me a valuable lesson: always trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. Have you ever experienced a moment where your instinct saved you? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how you stayed safe. Story 10: The Appalachian Trail Encounter. The Appalachian Trail has always called to those seeking escape, a place where the wilderness offers solitude, and nature wraps you in its quiet embrace. My girlfriend, Lily, and I had been dreaming of this trip for months. We craved the stillness, the crisp autumn air, the chance to leave behind the noise of the world. What we didn't realize was that some places hold secrets, and some trails lead you into shadows you aren't prepared to face. Our hike began as a romantic getaway but quickly turned into something we would never forget. By the time we left the woods, we weren't just exhausted, we were haunted. Before I tell you what happened, let me ask you, have you ever been alone in the wilderness and felt like you weren't really alone? If so, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And while you're here, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Tells for more tales of the unknown. We started our hike early on a cool October morning, the leaves ablaze with hues of gold and crimson. The trail stretched out before us, quiet and inviting. Lily and I joked about the horror stories we'd heard about the Appalachian Trail, tales of disappearances, strange encounters, and eerie lights. We laughed them off, feeling invincible with the daylight on our side. By late afternoon, we veered off the main trail to find a more secluded spot to camp. It was perfect, a small clearing near the edge of a rocky cliff, with a stunning view of the valley below. The steep drop-off gave us a sense of security, as though the terrain itself would protect us. We set up camp, cooked a simple dinner, and watched the sunset paint the sky in fiery reds and purples. It was beautiful, peaceful, the kind of moment you remember forever. But as the night crept in, so did the unease. The fire crackled softly as we sat close, talking about nothing and everything. The world around us seemed to fall into a deep slumber, the sounds of the forest fading into stillness. Then came the first sound, a faint rustling just beyond the edge of the clearing. "Probably a deer," I said, trying to reassure Lily as much as myself. But Felicia, our German shepherd, who rarely barked without reason, growled low and steady. Lily and I exchanged a glance. The rustling grew louder, closer, until it stopped abruptly. We stared into the darkness, the firelight casting flickering shadows on the trees. "Do you think it's a bear?" she whispered. I shook my head. Bears don't stop like that. The night grew colder as the fire died down. But neither of us could sleep. We stayed close to each other, listening to every sound, every shift of the wind. By midnight, exhaustion overtook us, and we retreated into the tent. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when Lily shook me awake. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "There's someone out there," she whispered. At first, I thought she was dreaming. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against fabric. It was slow, deliberate, circling the tent. My heart pounded as I grabbed the revolver I always brought on trips like this. "Stay quiet," I mouthed to Lily, grabbing the flashlight. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire was out, and the clearing was bathed in moonlight. At first, I saw nothing. But then, just beyond the tree line, a shadow moved. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling but firm. The figure froze, then stepped back into the trees. "We're armed," I shouted, hoping it would scare them off. For a long moment, there was silence. Then the sound of footsteps faded into the distance. The next morning, we packed up and left in a hurry. Neither of us wanted to spend another night in that clearing. The sense of being watched stayed with us as we hiked, every sound making us jump. By midday, we found a boot print in the dirt, a fresh print that didn't belong to either of us. "Someone's following us," Lily said, her voice barely audible. I nodded, gripping the revolver tightly. "Let's keep moving." We walked faster, our nerves frayed with every step. The forest felt darker, the trees more menacing. By the time we stopped to rest, we were both on edge. That night, we chose a spot near a sheer rock face, thinking it would limit the ways someone could approach. We kept the fire blazing, its warmth doing little to ease the chill in our bones. Around midnight, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps circling the camp. They were slow, deliberate, like the person wanted us to know they were there. "Do you see anything?" Lily whispered. I scanned the darkness with the flashlight, but the beam revealed nothing. By the next morning, we were running on adrenaline. We hiked as fast as we could, desperate to reach the parking lot where our car was waiting. As we rounded a bend in the trail, I felt it again, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I turned slowly, and there he was, about 50 yards behind us. A figure stood in the middle of the trail. He was dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by the shadows of the trees. "Don't stop," I said to Lily, keeping my voice steady. We kept walking, but I couldn't help glancing back. The figure remained motionless, watching us. Then, without warning, he stepped into the woods and disappeared. We didn't stop moving until we reached the parking lot. The sight of our car was a relief like I'd never felt before. We reported the encounter to the local authorities, but they found no evidence of anyone else on the trail. They chalked it up to paranoia or a prank. But Lily and I knew better. Whoever, or whatever, had followed us wasn't playing games. They knew the terrain. Knew how to stay just out of sight. It's been years since that hike. And I haven't gone back to the Appalachian Trail. Sometimes I still hear the sound of footsteps in my dreams. Slow and deliberate. Circling just outside my view. The wilderness can be beautiful. But it can also be unforgiving. If you're planning a trip, always trust your instincts. Sometimes the most dangerous things out there aren't the wildlife, they're the people hiding among the trees. Have you ever had an encounter in the woods that left you questioning what's really out there? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how you made it through. The Appalachian Trail is a place of wonder, a vast expanse of natural beauty where silence speaks louder than words. But for Lily and me, it became a place where the unknown revealed its darker side. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that we escaped something far more sinister than we realized. Who, or what, was out there? Lurking just beyond the firelight? Were they hunting us? Or were we simply intruding on something we weren't meant to see? I still hear the crunch of leaves in my nightmares. Feel the weight of unseen eyes as I walk in the dark. It makes me wonder, how many others have felt the same on those trails? And how many never made it back to tell their story? If you've ever had a close call, an encounter that left you questioning what's truly out there in the wild, share it in the comments below. I'd love to hear your story and how you coped. As we wrap up this chilling tale, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey into the unknown. If you enjoyed this story, or if it kept you awake a little longer than you'd like, please give this video a like. It helps more than you know. Don't forget to share this with your friends who love a good scare. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Wolf Tells for more spine-tingling stories that remind us why some mysteries are better left unsolved. The woods hold secrets. And this isn't the last tale they have to tell. Stay tuned for our next video, where we'll explore another story of survival, suspense, and the uncanny. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and always trust your instincts. This is Wolf Tells, signing off.